Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Europe's culture wars have undermined the Cold War liberal bourgeois consensus. And they are indeed a form of a state-sponsored crime that filters down to the entire society and is not necessarily limited to impacting the targeted marginalized groups in society. Nor are culture wars the exclusive domain, the monopoly, if you will, of the far right, although they are indeed at the core of culture wars, whether it is in Europe, especially in countries like Hungary, Poland, Austria, Italy, but also France, Germany, with far right-wing parties, all European countries from Northwest Europe, the advanced capitalist countries, to the periphery of Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, all of them have far right-wing parties, and culture wars have been feeding the frenzy of the far right. Now, the question is, why has Europe gone the route of using culture wars in a manner that so polarizes society? And given that the mainstream liberal bourgeois political parties and some of the on the center left claim that they are adamantly against it, the identity politics that these political parties pursue has actually, in the last 40 years or so, under the neoliberal political economy and social contract, been feeding culture wars. And on the surface, culture wars seem to be a struggle, cultural / political, between the far right and the liberal center left. Although really both of these groups, both the liberal center as well as the conservatives and the far right, serve and are subservient to the neoliberal elites. They are subservient to the capitalist class that benefits from culture wars by distracting the masses, the population, the general population, the middle class and the working class, whether in Europe, in India, the United States, regardless, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, doesn't matter what it is, regardless of where what country it is, the distraction is there by the capitalist class behind the political class, promoting culture wars as a distraction from the stagnation in living standards and downward social mobility of the last 40 years or so under the neoliberal social contract. Now, I regard cultural wars as a form of state-sponsored crime, and indeed there is literature that empirically supports this, considering that this is not a victimless exercise. There are victims here, people who die, people who languish in prisons, people who endure persecution by the state, by the police, people who are forcibly exiled, forced to be repatriated, people who endure low wages because of their ethnic / racial / religious orientation. So this is not about something that has to do with some innocuous exercise, but rather there are real victims here. So culture wars are to be taken very seriously, especially given that they have been used, whether again in Hungary under Viktor Orban or in Italy under Giorgia Meloni. It doesn't matter where in Europe, all over Europe by the far right, or in the United States under Trump, or in Argentina under Javier Milei, or in India under Modi, or in Turkey under Erdogan. Culture wars have been used to keep society polarized and to keep the popular base mobilized behind the group promoting culture wars. The question is, of course, given that this topic is about the breakdown of the liberal bourgeois consensus of Europe that was forged after World War II, and it remains so until the rise of neoliberalism that in Europe starts with the United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher in the late 1970s, in the United States in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, although the antecedents go back to Jimmy Carter, sort of, but institutionalized really under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And then, of course, internationalized thereafter. By the way, the original experiment was a US imposed experiment on Chile during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in the 1970s, the military dictatorship, CIA overthrown, of course, Salvador Allende overthrew Salvador Allende and imposed a military dictatorship there with the support of the local elites, the national elites there in Chile. And there, that's where neoliberalism was tested. The crisis of neoliberalism has led to culture wars, which I said, in my view, as I pointed out, in my view, are not a victimless crime. There are victims all over Europe as a result of this. This is not only to mention people, again, people enduring very low living standards because of their ethnic, religious, racial origin, or whether it is in the United States with the US, of course, pursuing Latinos, or in India using Islam, using the Muslim issue, the Muslim minority issue, as a pretext to rally the Hindu majority behind Modi's political party. This is a serious issue that impacts society, that keeps society divided. Now, as to the European embracing of culture wars, there are various theories in the literature that has been published, especially scholarly literature, but also some very good journal articles in international press about culture wars in Europe. The advocates of culture wars insist on the mental construct, on the myth of European identity, the purity of European identity. Well, let's look at the European identity. What exactly is European identity? All of Europe, the Balkans included, by the way, parts of the Middle East, North Africa, was at one time during the era of the Roman Empire, part of that larger Roman Empire, part of Pax Romana. The catalyst to unity in Europe was the Roman Empire. When it collapsed in the 5th century, when the fall of Rome took place, the catalyst was the Catholic Church in the highly decentralized Europe, which had been, which was dominated by barbarian tribes. So when we look at Europe and we talk about identity, the fact is the barbarian invasions from the East, from Slavs to Huns to Visigoths, Ostrogoths, we have all sorts of tribes, Vandals, tribes moving, barbarian tribes moving into what is the continent of Europe from the east. These tribes intermingled with various others, especially after the invasion of the Iberian Peninsula by Muslims and the control of the Iberian Peninsula by Muslims, but also Byzantines had, which of course is the Eastern Roman Empire, the legacy carried out, the legacy of the Eastern Roman Empire. All of this was a European mixture, gypsies included. European culture was held together in a highly decentralized form of society, the feudal manorial structure, where everything was local, the economy was local, the local lords controlled the estates. So throughout Europe, there was no nation state. It was the nation state was the outgrowth of the waning of the feudal manorial system in the 14th century, coinciding with the Black Death and the emergence of capitalism and the slow rise of nation states in Western Europe, and formalized, of course, in the 17th century with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. So we have basically the evolution from a highly decentralized organization, a political organization in Europe, to emergence of nation states. But even then, the fact is a number of countries, for example, let's take Italy. Italy was not a nation state until 1860. Germany was not a nation state until 1870, when Otto von Bismarck unified it. So the fact is that nationalism is of a fairly new fairly new. It doesn't go back to ancient times. So when they talk about European identity, we have the evolution of the last 2,000 years of European history of a huge mixture of religions, of ethnicities, of races, although the concept of race is a manufactured concept, by the way. There's only one race, that's the human race. So we have a Europe that's highly heterogeneous. So when the culture warriors speak of cultural purity, what are they talking about? There is no cultural purity. There is no purity, European identity, period, because it's very heterogeneous, from Russia to the Balkans, from the Balkans to the Iberian Peninsula, from the Scandinavian countries to Austria and Eastern Europe, East Central Europe. This is a very heterogeneous region. Even in religion, they claim, well, religion, we're Christians, versus, of course, what they mean is the Muslims, the Muslim invasion of Europe in the post-World War II period, especially after the revolution of Iran in 1979. Okay, let's take that issue. Up until the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century of Martin Luther and John Calvin, what we have is Catholic Europe. The Protestant Reformation, however, begins to divide the Christian community itself. Christianity is not itself homogeneous. There are all varieties of Christians. When we look at both religious makeup as well as ethnic makeup, linguistic makeup in Europe today, what we see is the heterogeneity of that reality, and that is Europe. It is not as multicultural and diverse as the United States, which I agree with a number of American historians that the United States is indeed England Junior, the William Appleman Williams thesis of America emulating the mother country, indeed very true. However, where is the purity there? Considering these are colonial people, these are people who came from Europe and the rest of the world to North America and settled there and marginalized the native population, Indians. And yet the native population are the marginalized people against, of course, that who were targeted by the invaders. So what we have here are indeed delusional ideological assumptions reinforced by 19th century pseudoscientific ideology called social Darwinism, which is a white supremacist racist ideology used to this day. At one time it was taught as science, although nothing scientific about it. It has nothing to do with Darwin, by the way. The idea that indeed there is racial superiority, again, race is a construct. There is no such thing. It's just the human race. More and more scientific research, of course, considering coming out even to this day with the support of artificial intelligence devices, shows us that indeed one single human race, period. We all evolved from the same origins. So the question is, why have such culture wars? If they did not serve a political agenda whose goal is to maintain the privileged elites in power, in that privileged status position. Culture wars reflect not the popular culture as some try to imply, especially the apologists, that culture wars are the expression of the common man. No, they're not. They are indeed manufactured. They are constructed. They're financed. They're propagated by the hegemonic culture. Study after study shows empirically, with empirical evidence, that this is the case. This is a top-down enterprise. This is not bottom-up. It is top-down, propagated in every sector, from the media to scholarly, pseudo-scholarly, I should say, pseudo-scholarly works that advocate there is indeed such thing as purity. And the other aspect of this is that they maintain that somehow if you purify, this is the underlying assumption, very important here, whether we look at it in the European context or in the United States, where culture wars are raging, by the way, under this administration, the Trump administration, or other countries around the world, what we see is that there is an underlying assumption that somehow if we purify the culture, which means what exactly? Who is eliminated and who decides what marginalized populations to get rid of, to sideline even more and persecute, using the law, using institutions to sideline? Who decides that? The elites, the political class behind which is the financial, which rests the financial elites. And the question here is very fundamental. As a historian who spent decades teaching a very important concept in the development of civilization from ancient China, ancient Persian, ancient Athens, and of course Rome, there is one catalyst to human progress, to the progress of civilization. And that catalyst is cultural diffusion. It's the opposite of culture wars. Cultural diffusion requires human empathy. It requires tolerance, which is part of the liberal bourgeois consensus that I addressed at the beginning. The concept of tolerance is an integral part of the liberal philosophy of English thinker John Locke of the 18th century, who influenced European constitutions as well as the United States Constitution and political liberalism of course, political philosophy of liberalism throughout the world. Tolerance. Culture wars entail necessarily intolerance. Culture wars often mean unleashing a reign of terror, if you will. The reign of terror took place in 1793, 1794 in France, essentially persecuting the enemies of the revolution when the revolution got out of hand, and anyone who was suspect was persecuted. There is an approach here to following a reign of terror against the marginalized populations, as though if they somehow disappeared or if they were eliminated, this is Hitlerian thinking in some sense, just like the Third Reich had this obsession: if we eliminate the Jews, the Gypsies, the communists, society would be better off. The idea that you eliminate the people who culturally enriched, economically enriched the society, in other words, that you go against the empirical evidence of 5,000 years of history of civilization, that cultural diffusion, the enrichment of civilization, comes as a result of everyone contributing with their creative endeavors to make civilization better and with their work. Instead of doing that, persecuting and eliminating and creating some sort of a delusional dream, that some kind of a structure that somehow if you purify, which by the way is by definition nonsense, because there is no such thing as purification, because where is the line drawn? That's the problem. Historically, with those that have endeavored to create so-called purified societies and isolate society, which means regression of society, by the way, because society is enriched by cultural diffusion. And of course, there is an element of anti-humanist, I should say, an element of hating humanity, in a sense, when we have that approach that we are going to target a segment of the population, segment of humanity, simply because they are of a different ethnicity, different religion, different language, different customs, different beliefs. That in itself is a sign of regression. The idea of culture wars comes as an outgrowth of the crisis of the neoliberal system, of the neoliberal political economy, especially after the Great Recession of 2008, by the way, and it really takes off in the 2010s with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. But this is not to say that Europe, I reject the thesis categorically in journal articles and scholarly articles that the reason that Europe has culture wars is because of the United States. That's nonsense. Europe invented culture wars. And it's not just Germany in the late 19th century, Kulturkampf, which means cultural struggle, during an era when Prussia, Protestant Prussia, conservative Junker class, the aristocracy, with Otto von Bismarck, who became Chancellor of Germany, going after the Catholic Church in terms of determining who will have the culture, who will determine the hegemonic culture of Germany. Kulturkampf was also used by the Third Reich, by the way, the cultural struggle. Europeans are very experienced with culture wars. It is not that they are learning from the United States. The US, it is true, from President Trump to Vice President J.D. Vance to American propaganda promoting culture wars and wanting to globalize culture wars. That is all true. Promoting far right-wing parties, also true. It is no secret that the United States under the GOP wants a globalized far right-wing regime that mirrors that of the United States, not realizing what a disaster in itself that is, considering that an integral element of culture wars is nationalism, and nationalism necessarily, historically, when you look at the empirical evidence from the 17th century to the present, necessarily means clash, because their belief, the identity of the individual with a nation state, means that they are willing to sacrifice themselves for the nation state, for the idea of a nation fighting for some greater idea, and destroy each other. The famous thesis of World War I, Grande Illusion in French, which is the big illusions, the great illusions, that they were somehow, were all going to be great nations if they just went to war and eliminated the enemy. Culture wars, there is a reason why the term war is used, because it is a form of a struggle, of a war, against what? In my view, this is self-defeating. This is a war against itself, against society itself. The ultimate loser is society and its future prospects. Why is this happening? It is happening because there is a crisis in neoliberalism, and the crisis in neoliberalism in the European context means that it must be the fault of the European Union. There are a lot of European nationalists, whether it's Hungary or the Brits that exited from the European Union, whether it's Poland, it doesn't matter. They're gung-ho about going to war against Russia. They have no problem with military adventures, by the way, and converging when it comes to military adventures, but they are not as enthusiastic when it comes to interdependent cooperation for the advancement of all European citizens, including the migrants. Let me point out, by the way, that Europe, as a continent with a colonial legacy, created culture wars. They, not the global South, not Africans, not Asians, they, the Europeans, went and colonized, divided, underdeveloped, exploited, engaged in the transatlantic slave trade. They were the cause of the devastation of Africa and Asia. And even during decolonization, after World War I, and especially after World War II with India and Africa, even post-colonization era, the fact is that the Europeans, along with the United States, continued to exploit the global South. The latest example, a glaring example, and I'm only mentioning it because this is December 2025, and the headlines are about the United States claiming that the subsoil rights of Venezuela, by the way, Venezuela happens to have the largest oil deposits in the world, belong to the United States. The president of Mexico pointed out that that's like claiming the subsoil of the United States belongs to the Latin America. This is the mindset of the Europeans, and of course the United States is Europe Junior. It was a colonial entity that became independent of the mother country of Great Britain. So what they have a mindset of colonial exploitation, a mindset of a hierarchical structure in every respect, socioeconomic, political, as well as cultural. So they are the ones who created the underlying conditions for this. Let me make something else very clear, by the way. The Europeans have been complaining that there has been, especially since the Iranian Revolution, an influx of Muslims, um, Africans as well as Muslims from the Middle East into Europe. When you look at the destabilization of Africa and the Middle East by NATO itself, the United States is included in this. When you look at the both covert operations and direct military campaigns, especially in the 21st century, why is it surprising whether it is people coming from the Sudan, from Libya, from Syria, from Iraq, coming over to Europe? Why, when the Europeans, along with the United States, have destabilized those countries, so those people are fleeing war-torn zones? Why does that surprise them? That's mind-boggling. They go into these countries, they destabilize them directly and indirectly, covertly, or through local elites, the local military, or political, or the local government, the government in that nation. And then those people flee. They create civil war conditions, like in the Sudan. They invaded Afghanistan, they invaded Iraq, they invaded and bombed Libya, they created civil war conditions in Yemen and Syria. They create destabilization throughout the Middle East and North Africa, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. And then that population comes north to safety and survival, which is, as Charles Darwin correctly pointed out, an animal instinct. All animals, including humans who are animals, are have that instinct. They want to survive. They come to Europe to work. They come to Europe to work, to survive, find peace, and survive and work. They are paid well under what the average European worker is paid. They are exploited from one corner of the European continent to the other, by the way. It's no different. They get the worst jobs and they're exploited, just like the Latinos in the United States, no different, which the United States government is pursuing aggressively as though they're criminals. These are workers. In the neoliberal context, this is an integral part in scholarly literature of the class war of neoliberalism. This is a war of the capitalist class against the working class. And they go after the weakest segment of the working class. They're not going to go after trade unions. They're going out, although they do go after trade unions as well. They go after the weakest segment of the working class, the immigrants. And there they have the political cover of the far right, but even of the center, by the way. Now, I want to mention something that struck me when I first came, when this document first came to my attention. The European Central Bank, hardly an institution that's against the European financial and political elites, commissioned a study under Christine Lagarde, used to be, by the way, the head of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, on the prospects of European economic growth in this century, in the 21st century. That study concluded that given the European demographics of the last 3 decades and the prospects moving forward, given the reality that European birth rates are hover close to about 1%, just a little bit over 1%. Very low, very low. It is impractical. It is impossible. And by the way, this study has been backed by independent scholarly studies. Not to have an influx of a population in Europe in order for Europe as a whole to be able to compete with the larger economies in the world, namely China, Japan, the United States. In other words, the European Central Bank study, forget the independent scholarly studies because someone may argue, well, they're prejudiced. Okay, they're prejudiced. European Central Bank, pro-business, pro-status quo, concluded that it is impossible for Europe to have any prospects for economic growth in the absence of having a steady influx of immigrants. Okay. Now, you would think a pragmatic politician and pragmatic elites would set aside misanthropic delusions and their lack of empathy and their sociopathic behavior toward and white supremacist assumptions toward non-European immigrants, including, by the way, they're also just as harsh toward Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans, but especially Muslims and Africans. You would think they would set that aside and look at the reality of what the European Central Bank report says. You're not going anywhere unless you have an influx of population, because without a steady growth in population, and like I said, European birth rates hover near 1%, just a little bit higher than 1%. Very low. Okay. High fertility rates you have among Muslims, among Africans, very low among white Europeans. Now, again, the question becomes, how impractical does a human being have to be to want to pursue the ideological fantasy of the purity of European civilization and civilizational erasure, another US European term that has been used? What is civilization erasure? What exactly is civilization if not something that's dynamic? Those who actually have studied civilization know that it's not static. It's not like a 2 billion old rock. It doesn't stay there forever. It is in constant state of change. Society is in a constant state of change. Civilization is in a constant state of change. Civilization by its nature grows through cultural diffusion. In the absence of that, there is stagnation. And the reality is that Europe as well as China are frightened by the reality of Chinese economic hegemony. It's that simple. No matter what they're doing, which is not good, by the way, so far in the last 30 years, they revert back to a single solution. And President Donald Trump just announced last night, okay, on the 22nd of December, he announced more money for defense. In fact, he's building bigger and better warships, destroyers. Immediately in the New York Stock Exchange, the share price of defense contractors skyrocketed. More for defense. Europe has the same approach. There is a direct correlation between militarism, the police state approach to society, whether in the United States or in Europe, and cultural wars. So culture wars are promoting police state methods. They're promoting authoritarianism, and it doesn't matter whether it is over in the United States, hybrid authoritarianism, as I like to call it. In other words, there is the electoral process, absolutely true, but the people elected have been financed, their campaigns have been financed and brought to you by the corporate world, whether it's corporate Europe or corporate America. That is what is going on. That is short-term thinking for Europe as well as for the US, but since we're on Europe, for Europe, which is the birthplace of Western liberalism, Western ideas of freedom and democracy, Western ideas about pluralism, about multiculturalism, Western ideas about an open society that advances through inclusion, not exclusion and marginalization of targeted groups through police state methods. How much progress, as the European Central Bank rightly said, report rightly concludes, how much progress can Europe make if tomorrow it throws out all of its immigrants and stops taking new ones through a fortress state, which unfortunately that's where they're headed? How much progress can they make on their own? None. They're headed to extinction. There was a very, I believe it was George Monbiot, who writes for The Guardian, the UK Guardian, who wrote an article about a little bit hyperbolic, but very, very intelligent individual, very intelligent writing about Europe going toward the road of extinction if they pursue this route. This is self-destructive. This is the incomprehensible part of culture wars, that it is indeed a road to self-inflicted wounds. China is not doing this to the United States and to Europe. They're doing it to themselves. They don't need China's help. They're doing it all on their own. And they're doing it because of one thing only: the quarterly profit report of corporations. And because of the sociopathic white supremacist idea that somehow they can create this thing that never existed to begin with, and that is purity of society, civilizational purity, instead of civilizational erasure like Trump and others of the right-wing ilk call it. What civilization erasure? First, we have to agree what civilization do we have to begin with? How did we get here? What does that civilization entail? And what are the ingredients of that civilization, or how does it go forward for the common progress, the common welfare of all citizens, without engaging in state-sponsored crime against marginalized groups? It is very difficult to see Europe not going more toward the road of cultural wars moving forward. Europe has been following, whether it has been under Democrats or Republicans, the lead of the United States. That's true. It has not been following the lead of the United States, contrary to a lot of speculation and people thinking, oh, well, it's because they're weak, or they see no choice, or they're pressured or blackmailed. That's not the reason. Although the United States has no problem blackmailing them, by the way. Say, for example, on the tariff wars, like the most recent example is the president of the United States calling up Emmanuel Macron and telling him to lower prices of certain products, otherwise the US would put tariffs on them. Okay, that's a form of blackmail. When you threaten tariffs, either lower your prices or we're going to put tariffs on them. However, Europeans have been pursuing culture wars entirely because they see, by Europeans, by the way, I get trapped in the general lingo myself here. By the European political and financial elites, corporate elites, business elites, they have been pursuing cultural wars. The elites, not the general population. General population follows. They follow because they somehow believe that their enemy in France is the Algerian worker. It's the worker from Morocco. It's not the factory owner. It's not the banker. It's not the shareholders, the large stockholders of companies. It's the other worker. They turn against each other. They have historically done this, by the way. Workers have historically either turned against the machines during the early industrial revolution or turned against each other. And the elites have been successful. The political and business elites have been successful in directing them toward that road, and they fall for it. The culture wars are successful because there is a following. The following comes from the bottom, from the people who are disillusioned. They don't know what is the problem. They don't know who to blame. So they blame other workers because the media, the institutional structure is based on culture wars. It's not just the politicians. It's also the media that propagates. It's not just the media that propagates. It's also the private sector. It's mainstream institutions. It's the education system. So you have basically a barrage of propaganda, indoctrination on a mass scale in society that tells them, you know who the enemy is? You're a Catholic Frenchman. It's the Muslim from Algeria. That's the enemy. In Germany, you know who the enemy is? It's the Turkish Muslim. That's the enemy. That it's not the industrialist. It's not big business in Germany exploiting your labor and the labor of that Turkish worker. It's the Turkish worker. So if we just eliminate the Turkish worker, although the European, I keep repeating this, the European Central Bank comes out and says, by the way, we actually need more Turkish workers, because without the Algerian and the Turkish worker, without the influx of immigrants from the global South, from Vietnam to Libya and so forth, coming into, and by the way, taking enormous risks coming up to Europe, and many dying on the way. Without them, what are the prospects of European economic growth and social, political, and economic equilibrium? Just take it from the European Central Bank. Not very good. Left to its own devices with these delusional theories of European civilization, Western civilization erasure, the only place Europe is going is in decline. That's all it's going. It has been in decline, but it is not because of the immigrants. The immigrants, whether in Europe or in the United States, enrich. When you look at statistics, by the way, they enrich European society. They are not just workers, they're scientists, they're teachers, they contribute, they're doctors, they're nurses, they contribute to every field of European society. They enrich European society. They become an integral part of it. And yet they are targeted as cultural enemies of society. Instead of expressing gratitude toward them, first for exploiting them for 500 years under European colonialism and post-colonial period, where the French, for example, were buying uranium from Niger until Niger kicked them out a few years ago, for $5 or €5, I believe, per kilo, when it was selling in the international market for 300 per kilo. That's exploitation, by the way. Or whether you have the United States seizing the assets, the oil assets of, and killing people in the Caribbean, of Venezuela, seizing oil tankers, killing people, allegedly drug traffickers. Where the United Nations has asked, where's the evidence for this? They're not presenting any evidence. They don't have to present evidence. We just know they're trafficking drugs. Fine, where's the evidence? No evidence. This Eurocentric, white supremacist, racist mentality is driving culture wars. Racism and hatred for the other, to use the existential term of Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, instead of looking in the mirror and seeing that the other is the self, that they are the ones that have created these problems. It's not the person they have driven from their home in the global south because of their military interventions to come up to Europe for safety and to get a job, to survive for themselves and for their family. I thank you for watching. Thank you for watching, and I ask you to become members of this station. This is an educational station, and to write comments, ask questions. Thank you very much.